Okay, we finally figured it out. I'll turn myself down a little bit. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 13th episode of the Stellar Podcast. My name is Kolten, and I'm joined, as always, by Tyler Vanderhooven.
Hello.
Sorry we're late. We had a couple of technical difficulties that we couldn't figure out how to fix, but we're good now. This is the second time we're doing a live episode, and we decided to make it a little fancier. So if anything looks bad or it breaks, let us know. We'll try to fix it for the next time. This is kind of an ongoing effort to improve our sort of live stream, our live events, stuff like that. Before we get started, I wanted to pass the torch to Tyler to kind of do some housekeeping regarding SEF and all that good stuff. So take it away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Stellar Community Podcast live episode. This is our second live episode. It is fantastic to have upped our efforts. Big claps to Colton for getting that set up with all these fancy graphics. So today we're really just going to talk about three things. Briefly touch on the Stellar Community Fund, the SCF, and the ongoing discussion rounds there. Talk a little bit about our live events and the work that's been going on in setting up some of those hackathons and developer meetups and whatnot. And then we'll end with a nice little presentation by Kolten about assets and Trustlines and the differences between those, kind of like a little dev show thing with a fancy slide show, because we can do that when we're live. So just touch on Stellar Community Fund. It was a couple weeks ago now. We moved into the review period. So there are several different phases of the Stellar Community Fund. The first one is a open entry phase where everyone can submit their projects, and then that closes and we enter a discussion round. So people can see all of the entries that made it into the nomination round or into the open round, and then talk about all of those, provide feedback. So as you're able, we'll put links here in the show notes as usual. As developers or ecosystem participants, as you're interested, as you want to see projects get built on Stellar, even just see what's possible on Stellar, it's a fantastic place to see where developers are building things and working on new and exciting projects. So be sure to spend some time looking around those. There's a couple more weeks, I think, of the discussion period before the next round of nominations goes live, where we get to vote. I think there's like 20 projects this round, something like that, and that will get narrowed down to a final 8 through the first round of voting. So now is a very critical period of time where we talk about the projects, and those projects have an opportunity to improve before it goes into the first nomination round, where we narrow down from that 20 to 8, and then from that 8 there'll be a final vote, which then splits up those 3 million lumens by vote percentage to those 8 different projects. And for those who may be unfamiliar, the Stellar Community Fund is a fund where 3 million lumens are split up across 4 different rounds every year. And so we're just now in the middle of our first round for 2020. And so if you're interested in that, or have projects that you're working on, or opportunities you might think where you have something you'd like to enter, be sure and take a look at the Stellar Community Fund as an opportunity for kind of like a initial seed fund for your projects. So Colton, as you've been working on the dev stuff, I know a lot of your work has been geared towards in your past life, a lot of creativity, a lot of videos and marketing, and interesting history in esports that I still don't fully understand. So maybe talk a little bit about that and how you've been applying those skills towards beefing up and spreading out our efforts towards live events, and particularly in the role you have as a community manager.
Yeah, for sure. So with the state of the world right now, everybody knows that we're all cooped up inside. I mean, me and Tyler are cooped up at our houses right now. And so a lot of events are starting to move online. And usually, the way most people and projects have been doing these sort of events is through Zoom and like just live streaming the live Zoom call and stuff. And I figured it'd be a lot better if we put a little bit more production effort behind our stuff. As you can see, like we're in these nice little boxes that we're in on the stream, with these like little graphics and stuff. And there's ways that we can make these streams more robust in the future, but we thought it'd be good to start small and then kind of incrementally improve. But basically, we have a couple of online events coming up where we've upped the production value a little bit compared to other online events. And a lot of this is going to be based on feedback from you guys too. We want to see, does this format work? How do you guys feel about it? Where can we improve it? All that good stuff. But I know this week we have the first of a new series called Engineering Talks, and Tyler will be giving the first one. We'll kind of touch on that toward the end of the podcast and like what the details of that are. But basically, every other week we're going to be hosting a live event, and it's going to be an engineering talk where an engineer hops on and sort of talks about whatever they're working on or some future stuff they might be working on. That way you guys get a better sort of like behind the scenes view of what people are working on at Stellar. And you're going to hear from a lot of people that you've never heard from before, and that's kind of the goal. I think the first two are me and Tyler, so you can't get rid of us yet. But the other ones will be people who you haven't really heard from. Some of them will reflect talks that were given at Meridian and all that good stuff. So be looking out for that. Also, we're trying a new thing next week where we are going to basically put together a roundtable where there's going to be like engineers and people from a couple of different businesses within the Stellar ecosystem talking about a new Stellar ecosystem proposal, which is basically a standard that most people should adhere to on the network. But basically, they're going to get together. They're going to talk about how to build this thing out, and that's something we're going to try to do a lot going forward. That way, we can kind of open up that process a bit, because right now it's pretty dev focused, and we want to get more eyes, more ears on the things going on as far as ecosystem standards. So we'll be working on that a lot. And then additionally, we're going to be pursuing like virtual hackathons and stuff. Like we just recently did our first in-person hackathon, which we've talked about a million times, so I won't harp on it again. But for those of you who are interested in that type of stuff, there will be virtual hackathons. We're kind of looking at our options right now, the best way to do that. But of course, as collateral for those hackathons, there'll be things like workshops and blog posts and all that good stuff coming out. So I would say we're in a pretty good spot as far as online content goes, and we're going to be putting out a bunch of stuff over the next couple of months. So I'd keep an eye out for that. And we'll also continue these sort of ongoing live streams and stuff. Anything you want to add, Tyler?
Yeah, where can people keep up with all the different Stellar related events?
Yeah, so we recently put together a stellar.org/events page. If you guys are interested, you can go there and see all the stuff that's scheduled. I think there's even past events on there. We recently hired somebody named Anka, who's kind of in charge of events now, and she's been doing a great job helping out in that area, and she played a big role in putting together the events page. So go there, keep up with the events. I think most of them have like an embed page for all of the live streams too, so you don't have to go scavenging the internet looking for links. You can subscribe to this channel, subscribe to the main YouTube channel, which I think is in the description. I'm not sure. If not, we'll add it there. And then you can also go to stellar.org/events and find all the videos.
Yep, super. It's important to be able to keep up and not feel like a fire hose, but know where to get your content. So the events page is fantastic for that. And then also even just our Stellar Twitter page is great for keeping up with upcoming events or links to past shows, recordings, etc. So those are definitely two main ones for just consuming and keeping an eye on content that we're putting out.
Totally. Okay, so now we kind of carved out a lot of time to talk about Stellar assets and their existential nature. I guess we can move on to that unless you have anything else you wanted to cover before we got started.
No, I think that's fantastic. And then depending on where our chat is on the YouTubes, maybe at the end we can answer some questions. Yeah, otherwise, I'll just invent some questions and we'll answer those.
Yeah, totally. So if I keep looking over to the right, and that's because I'm monitoring the health of the stream and I'm monitoring the chat a little bit. So if you guys have questions along the way, whenever we're kind of going through this presentation, feel free to ask. We're here to, here to help, and we want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to understand this stuff. So let's see if I can switch this without it breaking. Boom. Okay, and then I can click present. And we're awesome. We're good. We should be good. So is everything good on your end, Tyler? Nothing
I'm gonna bring it up. I actually don't have it up at the moment. I'm not watching our live stream. It's awkward.
Well, if something breaks, I guess the chat could always let us know. They're going to be a little bit behind because of the stream delay, but Also, for those of you who are listening to the recording of this, I highly suggest going over to the YouTube channel and rewatching the live broadcast because you'll get to follow along this presentation. I created it such that we can try to explain everything so that you don't have to go to the YouTube channel. But me and Tyler aren't perfect, so we'll do the best we can. And if anything, just head over to YouTube and you can.
We're
watch the
audio
replay.
people, man. This is all new for us.
Yep. All right. So before we dive in, I guess a little background on this. So one of the things that we found people sort of having trouble with, especially when they first get introduced to Stellar, are like, what are assets on the network? How do they exist? How do you get your hands on them? How are they connected to the real world? You start asking a whole lot of questions, right? You see 4 different USDs on the network, 3 different Bitcoins, a bunch of different euros and whatnot. So we wanted to kind of dive into what Stellar assets are, how they exist on the network, how balances exist on the network, all that good stuff, sort of what anchors are and how they exist. And so we put together this presentation to hopefully help with that, but we're a little biased. So anyways, so before we get started, here's the current overview of assets and trust lines on the network. There's currently like 7,200 assets total on the Stellar ledger. Obviously, some of these are more awesome than others. Some of these are more legit than others. Hopefully by the end of this, you kind of understand what a legit asset is, what a useful asset is, and all that good stuff. And it looks like there's 1.7, 1.8 million trust lines total on the network, which is quite a lot. That means people are figuring out how trust lines work. But it's still a tricky thing, and so we want to make sure that it's easy to understand going forward. So the basic assumption that people have whenever they hear like about an anchor or they hear about assets being issued on the network is, okay, an anchor just prints 5 million USD and they can send it to whoever they want on the account or that has an account on Stellar. As a user, you can just send and receive any asset you want, but really that's not how it works. This basic assumption is wrong, as indicated by the big red X and frowny face. But basically, the way it actually works is a little deeper, so let's explore, right? So a couple things to get out of the way. An anchor is just a regular Stellar account, right? They hold a Lumen balance, they have a public-private key pair, and you don't need any special permissions from the network to issue assets or anything like that. Anybody can do this, and that's why it's important that there's a little bit more nuance to sort of what asset issuance is and all that good stuff. So there's no difference between this anchor account you see on the screen and then my account that you see on the screen. They both just hold Lumen balances. So if assets don't just get printed out of thin air, they don't just exist and you can't send them to everybody, how do they exist? How do assets and balances exist on the network? Well, they exist through trust lines, right? So if you've ever explored Stellar by any stretch of the imagination, you've probably been like, okay, how do I hold an asset? And then you figured out that there's this trust line thing. And you're like, how do I send a trust line? And then some wallets are better at sort of abstracting this away than others. And eventually you find your way to submitting a trust line to some particular account. And you might not even know what that means. So hopefully this helps. But basically, a trust line is submitted to the network by a user as a change trust operation. And this change trust operation encapsulates things like who are you trusting? So what Stellar account are you trusting? What asset are you trusting? So in this case, you can see that my account is trusting some anchor account for USD. You also specify the amount for which you're willing to trust that anchor. Usually by default, and Tyler, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but most wallets, they just kind of set that to the max value for you, which is like 900 million of the whatever the coin is or something like that, some really high number. But you can also lower this, right, if you wanted to. So if you only trusted, say I only trust Tyler to issue me $5, then I can specify that, right? And he can never send me more than $5. Another thing to take note of is that trust lines cost a reserve fee of 0.5 XLM. And the reason for this is because it basically takes up ledger space. So if anybody could spam the network with billion, gajillion trust lines, and all of a sudden you have a lot of state bloat, the ledger becomes really hard to keep track of for nodes, and then people can't run nodes as easily, and then that creates problems. Another important note is that trust lines do not create a balance for the issuer. So this is where it gets a little weird, and hopefully by the end of this, we kind of make that more clear. But as you can see before, we have this anchor account with 300 lumens, and then we have my account with 25 lumens. Then when I actually issue a trust line to this anchor, I get a $0 US balance, but the balance for the anchor actually doesn't change. So one reason for this is because I can issue trust lines for any asset to any account on Stellar that I want to. So if this anchor were to be, I don't know, Bank of Tyler, and Tyler only issued USDs, and all of a sudden I was like, hey, Tyler, I want Euro tokens, and then I make him accountable for some balance of Euro tokens that he doesn't want to be accountable for, that could be problematic. And another, I guess, important note is that this is US dollars issued by this specific anchor account. So this specific seller address is the only seller address that I can receive these US dollar tokens from, or other people who trust this anchor address. Anything you want to add, Tyler, on that? I kind of talked for a bit.
No, that's good.
Okay,
I think
cool.
there are some tricky pieces that we'll get to in a minute, but
Okay, cool.
it's quite good so far.
So again, so let's imagine that now that I've trusted this anchor for US dollars and I give them US dollars from my actual bank account, which we'll ignore that flow for now. That might be a whole different talk that we'll have to do next time or something like that. But basically, if I deposit $5 of my real money to this anchor, they can then send me $5 to my Stellar account. And so now there are 5 total US dollar tokens issued by this anchor on Stellar. And you notice again, the balance of the anchor doesn't change, but my balance in my account changes, going up $5. Pretty straightforward so far, but it gets a little more nuanced, which we'll keep diving into. So now I can also send, right, USD to another account that trusts that anchor. So now all of these accounts who trust the specific anchor are interoperable. And you can see that the anchor sent me $5, and then I sent $2 to my friend who also trusts this particular anchor. And there's still $5 from this anchor in existence. Nothing here changes. And yeah, pretty easy. So now we want to talk about assets in practice. And to do that, I think one of the best examples is Anchor USD, just because so much of their infrastructure is really well fleshed out. It's really easy to follow for the normal person. So I mentioned earlier that anchors can issue an arbitrary amount of assets, right? They don't have a balance. And so that's a little weird. It's weird in a couple of cases, but one case could be like, say an anchor was issuing stocks on the network and they promised everybody like, hey, there will only ever be 1 million stock or 1 million shares of this stock in existence. And then you're like, you just trust them and trust their issuing account, but you have no way to verify that, right? They could just send shares of this stock to anybody they wanted. The only way you can verify the supply is by like checking the outstanding supply. But what if they wanted to, I don't know, be transparent from the beginning? So the way this happens is that an anchor sets up what's called an issuing account, and then they set up what's called a distributor account. So the issuing account, again, is the actual issuer of the asset, and then their distributor account is what holds the outstanding supply. So in this case, let's pretend that a bank wants to get started on Stellar, and they have $500,000 of pre-existing capital that they want everybody to know that they have. So they could do this by setting up their issuing account and sending $500,000 to their distributor account. And then from that point, start taking deposits from their users. So now users can see like, okay, they have $500,000 of working capital. I can pretty much trust that they're gonna, honor my withdrawals and stuff. But it goes a little deeper than that. So they also set up what's called a stellar.toml file. And in practice, this looks like on the right side of the screen, where you see the metadata provided by the issuer. So a stellar.toml file is basically where anchors fill in information about their business, what asset they're issuing, all that good stuff. And then services can then pull that information and present it to users so they can make educated decisions about who they're supposed to trust on the network. In this case, you can see that Anchor USD is issuing the US dollar. They kind of describe what that means. They say who their organization is, what their website is. You get information about the principals of the account, all that good stuff. And so the actual Stellar TOML file looks something like this. And you can see that they have both of their accounts listed. So this is probably the issuer. This is probably the distributor. Then you have more information about their open APIs, information about their organization, the principals on the account, and then information about the assets that they issue from this account. In this case, it's only USD. And then some more examples of this type of information are like Tempo's Euro token. You can see that they issue the Euro token, who their principals are, all that good stuff. Same with APay's asset Bitcoin. You can see the total supply, all that good stuff. So this is what it looks like in practice, right? So anchors provide information about their asset so that you know whether or not, or so that you can make a good decision in regards to who you should trust. Cool. Any questions about that? Doesn't look like. Okay, cool. So assets in practice continued. So now we understand that anchors usually set up two accounts, right? They set up an issuing account and a distributor account. And then how does that work whenever I want to hold US dollars? Well, I still have to trust the issuing account. One mistake we see people make, especially like new Stellar developers entering the ecosystem, is that they trust the distributor account, or they like make the distributor trust the user or whatever. And so that's a little bit of a weird flow. But the way it actually works is that everybody still has to trust the issuing account, but oftentimes the actual amount of money is distributed from the distributor account. That's kind of the whole point, right? It separates the logic of issuing the asset and then actually distributing the asset. And then you can see in this example, both the distributor account and my account have a trust line for USD to the issuing account. The issuing account has sent an initial transaction of 500,000 US dollars to the distributor account. It may be from my bank account, I deposited $200 into, whatever anchor service this might be. And then that anchor sends 200 US dollars from their distributor account to the US or my account. So now I have 200 USD. So this is like the basic setup that every anchor is going to follow. So that's why like you might think it's weird that you trust some particular account and then you don't receive your actual deposit from that account. If you've ever noticed that, which most people hopefully won't, right? Because we're abstracting all this away. But if you've ever noticed it, that's why, right? Nothing's broken, nothing's fishy going on. It's just this is how the flow works. And then most anchors, again, should provide information regarding the issuing account and the distributor account. But also what you can notice from this slide is that the issuing account never maintains some set balance of USD throughout the whole thing. Only the accounts that hold the asset that is issued kind of have a balance. Good on that, Tyler? Anything you?
Yeah, I mean that point of the issuing account being different from the distributor account, and those are, I think it's also worth noting that those are just names we assign to those. It's not like within Stellar there's a special issuing account type of account. We just call it that because that's the function that it serves.
Yeah.
But it definitely can trip you up initially. Like if you're sent a token, a US dollar token, and you send it back for some reason to the issuer, it gets burned. Like it doesn't show up in the issuing account as a balance. Issuing accounts don't hold a balance of their own tokens. They can just issue their tokens, and if that's intentional, that's important that those tokens can be burned. But you still might need a way around that, and that's how you get to the distributed account, where if you send your assets to a distributor is just like another user, right? How weird would it be if to get a payment from anybody's USD, you had to actually trust that individual account, where with this flow you just trust one issuer of the US dollar token, and then anybody who trusts that one account can then transact in those tokens. So a distributed account is just like me. It's just that as the distributor, I'm associated with the issuer and likely receive the lion's share of the initial token release, and then individual user accounts might get those assets from me. So they serve a purpose, but all three of these accounts are just Stellar accounts, just being used in very specific ways.
Right. And I guess like adding on to the fact that these aren't really any different from actual Stellar accounts is that that's the whole reason that Stellar TOML files like need to exist, right? Otherwise you would have this like huge conglomeration of like tons of different assets. Nobody knows where they're coming from or who they represent or anything like that. So the Stellar TOML file actually makes that whole process a little more clear. That way there is some separation of these accounts, but it's not on a protocol level. It's really just on an ecosystem level. So that means, right, that since anybody can issue these assets, there are generally multiples of the same asset, right? So if 3 different banks come onto the network, they most likely issue 3 different assets. They're not going to share Stellar accounts or anything weird like that. So you have all of these different assets, USDA, USDB, USDC, and these are all 3 different versions of US dollars. Who you trust is up to you based on the information provided from Stellar Toml, or maybe your association with that bank, or whatever else. So that's an important note, right? If you have a trust line for USD established with somebody, that's not a token to all the USD on the network. It's only a token for that issuer. So multiples of the same asset exist. You can choose who you want to choose, all that good stuff. So I guess that begs the question, like, how do all these things work together? What makes all of these different assets interoperable? And that's where the Stellar Decentralized Exchange comes in, right? So most of the time, anchors, if they want their asset to be publicly available or easily accessible or useful on the network, they create order books to make their assets useful and interoperable with the rest of the Stellar ecosystem. And the best way to do that is most likely to create an order book between your asset and XLM, XLM being the native token on the network, or the Lumen, mostly because every account has to have lumens. So most people interfacing with Stellar will know what a lumen is. They have to interface with it anyways. So they'll be able to go in and out of your asset using lumens. And so again, an order book, everybody should be kind of familiar with this, right? Their buy and their sell orders for a particular asset. You can choose which side of that order to take. And then so these order books basically allow users to trade in and out of assets, and then also facilitate path payments across assets, right? So for those of you familiar with this concept of a path payment, basically say we have a user who's using US dollars and he wants to send euros to a friend, but maybe he doesn't trust that euro provider or that euro issuer, but he still wants to send money to his friend, right? He can do that through a path payment, and he can specify, hey, I want to send $5 US. By the time it gets to my friend, I want it converted to euros. So basically, say both of these assets have a Lumen market or a Lumen order book, that $5 US will get converted to lumens, and those lumens converted to euros, and then the user basically receives euros, and nobody has to hold an asset they don't trust. Nobody has to interact with an asset they don't trust, and this exists across identical assets too, right? So say Bank of America and Wells Fargo both have an asset on Stellar, but users don't want to be able to, they can't hold deposits for either of those assets. So Wells Fargo doesn't want to hold Bank of America dollars and vice versa. You could just, if they both had active order books, you could just send a path payment across those assets, and then swap Wells Fargo dollars for Bank of America dollars. So now you have multiple of the same asset. They're still interoperable, because otherwise, if they weren't, then we'd have the same problem, right? If these assets couldn't be interoperable, then we'd have the same problem that we have in the current financial system. Any thoughts on path payments, Tyler?
Oh, loads. But we'll cover those tomorrow.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess to wrap up this sort of talk, and then we'll dive into some Q&A, because I saw a lot of decent questions in there. And then anybody who has questions, feel free to sort of throw them in there and touch on them, because I'm sure I skipped over a lot of stuff. But tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern time on the main Stellar channel, Tyler will be going over path payments in the first of our engineering talk series, but I'll let him cover what that's going to be about and look.
Yeah, I mean, the talk title is Practical Path Payments. I think there's a lot of value in taking these concepts that we've maybe heard of, but don't necessarily know how to use them or why we would choose to use them in certain scenarios, breaking that down a little bit into why I think path payments are one of the coolest features of Stellar, and a couple of different ways that you can use them right now, both as just users and as engineers building applications. So it's going to be a short talk, so we won't cover a whole bunch of stuff, but it should get the wheels turning, and maybe trigger some good questions and explorations into path payments.
Cool. So I guess now we'll dive into some questions. And again, if anybody has questions, please ask them. We have quite a bit of extra time. I went through that a lot faster than I thought I would, and maybe I should have stopped to breathe. I don't know. But the first question is, or it's not really a question. Well, it's kind of a question. Stop and explain why anyone would need an asset on Stellar, and sort of what's the advantage. I'll tackle this one first, but for those unfamiliar with Stellar, say you're listening to this for the first time, Stellar's goal is to make the current financial infrastructure interoperable. What does that mean? Well, the current financial infrastructure is set up such that pretty much everything is isolated in its own way, and the way that most of this stuff is isolated is that they all maintain their own database. So, for example, Whenever you deposit money into Cash App, they basically hold your money in escrow and they issue you a number in their local database saying, okay, user Kolten has $100 in his account. And then when I go to withdraw, they change that number to 0 or however much I withdraw and then give me my money in real life. The same with Venmo, same with your banks, right? You deposit money, they hold your money in escrow, give you a number in a database. The problem is that a lot of these databases aren't interoperable with each other. So if you want to send money from Cash App to Venmo, it just doesn't work. The benefit of using something like Stellar is that it's a shared database or a shared ledger, right? So if Venmo and Cash App and another bank were to sort of build their backend on Stellar, all of a sudden they're sharing a database and they're allowed to interoperate with each other, and they can create markets with each other. They can create markets for assets that otherwise wouldn't have them, and that allows you to sort of go, in and out of different applications. So that would be the benefit, right? Is that now all of these different types of financial infrastructure are sharing a backend, and they can easily interoperate. And I'll let, I guess, Tyler add any of his thoughts.
So you and I touched on this. When some of these other cryptocurrencies were putting assets on Stellar, so like a Bitcoin token or an Ethereum token, I had the same question. Why would you put some other blockchain token on the Stellar blockchain? And I feel like your answer was really good. So maybe you can kind of cover, why would somebody put a crypto and some other blockchain token, like not even a traditional financial token, on Stellar? Why is that important?
Yeah, and I guess, so leaving traditional finance, again, we still need a way to sort of seamlessly go in and out of different ecosystems, right? I think it's anybody who keeps up with the space knows that all the different chains kind of offer different things, different services, just based on the functionality that they provide. So, for example, Ethereum has different smart contract applications that it provides. Bitcoin offers different, whatever Bitcoin's use cases nowadays, things that it provides, and the list goes on. And so some things that exist on Stellar will not exist on Ethereum, and vice versa. Some things that exist on Stellar will not exist on Bitcoin, vice versa. And so it's important that people be able to seamlessly go sort of in and out of these different assets. And the benefit is that now I can interoperate or use any service on any chain that I want to be able to. So if I, say I have some extra ETH laying around and all of a sudden I want to use a Stellar application, I can then use an Ethereum anchor, deposit my ETH into the anchor. They'll give it to me on Stellar, and then I can hopefully use that ETH in a Stellar application, or maybe it's like DAI or USDC, some other token that exists on Ethereum, and then use it on a Stellar app. And then if I wanted to go back and use, say that same DAI on an Ethereum application, I could be able to do that. So that's kind of the benefit of not only having, crypto anchors, but also traditional financial anchors. Hopefully that answers. Let's see. I guess another question is like, what is the risk, right? Like, anchors by default aren't zero risk, and I mean, nothing is zero risk in life. That's not a fair answer. So, do you want to take on the risk question, or I can answer it? Or
how about you finish this one up, and then I'll take the next one.
Okay, so basically, your risk is counterparty risk, right? So, in the event that an anchor collapses, I don't know, maybe they're doing bad stuff or whatever, of course you run the risk of them failing and you not being able to redeem your deposit. But that risk exists with anything, right? Whether you're using a payment service or a bank or anything like that, the risk is all sort of similar. And so that's why it's important to sort of vet the anchors that you decide to use or the assets that you decide to trust. You want to make sure that you're doing your own research like you would in real life. I don't just blindly download financial applications and put my money in them, right? I need some sort of social confirmation. I need to do a little bit of my own research. Is this thing safe? Like, I remember when Venmo first came out back in the day, people were like, what the heck is this thing? Like, why would I ever put my money in this? And then over time, they build sort of social proofs. They build their reputation up. And then you kind of know now that you can trust Venmo to a pretty good extent. But if Venmo fails, you still can't redeem your deposits unless it's insured or anything like that. So that would be, I guess, the risk, right? The same risk that any financial institution has. Let's see. Questions. Okay, you might know an answer for this one. Regarding assets, what's a good way to issue NFTs on Stellar?
So NFTs That's shorthand for non-fungible tokens. When I hear the word fungible, I immediately think of mushrooms, but that is not what it means. It means, can you split a token up? So if you have a dollar, you can split it into cents, but there are assets that you don't want to be split up. That it's a unit, and you want to pass that unit from person A to person B, and not have them like cut it in half and sell half to somebody and sells half to somebody else. So there's this need to, it's not something that's easy to do on Stellar. Assets by default, actually, assets are required at the moment to be able to be split up. You can specify when you're creating a in the TOML file, the Stellar TOML file, you can say the number of decimals that you want a particular asset to have, but it's not necessarily honored by at a protocol level. Um, so Stellar does have, all blockchains have some minimum decimal number value that you can go down to. So Stellar is 7. So you could make an asset that is worth, that you only issue. So if you remember when you had the issuing account and a distributor account, you could have an issuing account that issues an NFT, a non-fungible token, to a distributor account for one stroop, for one unit. So 0.000001 of this thing, and send it to an issuing account, and then that issuing account can send it to anybody, and you can never split it smaller. So that's how you could get an NFT from a single, like right now. The big issue with that is because of the math inside of Stellar and the in32 limitations. If you were to go and trade that asset, you run into pretty quickly some limitations on how much you can ask for this asset. So I don't remember. I did some calculations when I was working on NFTs for my application Color Glyph. Um, like how much could you get paid? How many units of some asset could you get paid for this particular asset? I think it's like 214 or something like that. So you could never get paid more than 214 point something for this one Stroop NFT, which obviously is like, that's not a lot of lumens. But when you introduce something like path payments, what if that path payment went through Bitcoin, right? And so now all of a sudden you can get paid 214 Bitcoin for one NFT through a path payment. And all of a sudden that one NFT is worth a whole lot more. So being willing to think about NFTs and the trades that can be made for them through things other than just XLM via something like a path payment. So and then when it comes to data, right? So the actual embedded information, an NFT might have pixel values, like a color glyph has pixel values associated with it. Some might be like a PNG, even metadata around who created it, a description, title, etc. Um, Stellar's not a database for arbitrary data. You can work around some things with some managed data information, and even like putting in some memo stuff in a transaction, but it ultimately is not trying to be a data storage. So the better solution is to put that NFT data into some other database, and then point to that external metadata through a memo, like an ID address to like IPFS, or even like a BitTorrent. I've been doing some work around kind of, it's still a decentralized solution, but that data doesn't need to live on Stellar. In the future, depending on what the use case for NFTs in payments are, we may see some functionality added to Stellar to better support NFTs. But at this point, I think it's highly experimental, and we need to sort of figure out how NFTs are being used in a payment space, and not just in like CryptoKitties is kind of where it became a big thing. Like, oh, NFTs, we need to be able to do this. So it remains to be seen a bit how NFTs will play, or how they will come into Stellar. But they're, as far as like getting paid for NFTs, Stellar's great for that. It's just, where does that NFT data live at the end of the day, and how are these things transferred, and how do you make trades? But through things like path payments, the trade aspect of a one Stroop NFT are not as big an issue as maybe we would have originally thought.
Cool. Moving on, let's see. Brian asks, is there any way to make a Bitcoin anchor a bit decentralized? Um, I don't know. I've seen you ask this question before, and I've kind of been thinking about it. I mean, I don't know if there's any perfect way to make it fully decentralized. I think there might be ways to make it trust minimized through like different multi-sig implementations and things like that. Um, of course, you'll still have some counterparty risk in regards to like the implementer of that type of protocol or anything like that. I don't know. I think it would be cool to see somebody explore it. I know people have been exploring, different ways to do trustless atomic swaps across chains and stuff like that. Those might not work directly with Stellar, but that type of technology could be interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have like a perfect answer, but it is something that I would like to sort of see people explore because that would be cool, right? To have trust minimized bridges between Stellar and then other ecosystems.
I think a lot of it comes down to what's your definition of decentralized.
Yeah.
That's a really loaded word. I feel like we all think we know what it means, but we all probably think something different. Um, so having a bit of conversation around what decentralization means, and does that mean nobody has to trust anybody? Because I don't think that's really possible. And it's more no one person or even several entities have complete control. But if you start exploring that definition, there are lots of decentralized things that are actually quite centralized or could become centralized quite easily, where takeover just isn't that hard to do. Where you have multi parties, but as you start to add weights and percentages, pretty soon something that was decentralized is now not. So I think you really need to start with what is decentralization, and once you have a better understanding of what that means, you can begin to explore how would we accomplish that um, in something like in an anchor scenario where you're moving from either traditional financial architecture like a bank or even just another blockchain, and making those swaps happen without some third party entity having to have direct control, or their servers, their 2 or 3 servers be online at any given time, or if one entity went bankrupt, it wouldn't destroy um, the usefulness of your tokens. Those kinds of things I think would be really important and helpful. But starting with the term decentralization probably isn't helpful. It's better to think of it in the terms of how do we minimize our counterparty risk, to where there's not these dangers of entities going down, and those entities are spread out across multiple parties. It's a little bit harder to do, and I honestly think order books kind of help that a little bit, especially when it comes to path payments, where you can really quickly move between um, Party A's Bitcoin token and Party B's Bitcoin token. And if Party B is looking a little shaky, you can just kind of switch. Everybody moves over to one or the other, and in that sense, you do get decentralization for a token that's on Stellar that's a Bitcoin token. You just have to build the services where it becomes very easy to move between one to the other. Which again, I don't know how easy or difficult that would be, but it's definitely worth exploring. It's just we need to make sure we understand our terminology before we explore too deeply, and everybody's like, that's not what decentralization means.
Yeah. I mean, decentralization, like everybody's definition, like you mentioned, is arbitrary, and there's been a lot of conversations, especially within the last year, about decentralization sort of existing on a spectrum, and I think that's fundamentally true. There's a lot of arguments to be had for why centralization is good in some circumstances and why it's not favorable in others, or why it's even bad in other circumstances. So, I mean, I guess it just depends. Like, because in the event that something is centralized, then you might be able to provide insurance on that service, whereas something that's decentralized, it gets a lot harder to provide insurance on that. And maybe I want that insurance, and maybe that's not something that's valuable to you. So the anchor you choose to provide your sort of Bitcoin token or whatever token it is might be very different from mine, and that's the good thing about open markets, right? And open networks is that people can create these things, and you have the choice as a user to interact with whatever you want. And the more of that we have, the better. So the more we onboard anchors and the more people experiment with the things they have to offer, the features they have to offer, the better we'll be able to sort of make decisions that way. So let's see, what else do we have? This one's kind of abstract, but maybe we can explore it a little bit. We have some time. Do you guys see Stellar being the de facto backend for other blockchains, or is this space in full isolation mode at the moment? Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go?
Absolutely not. If you switch it out for, do you see Stellar being the de facto payments backend? That would be fantastic, and that's what we'd love to see. But like, what the heck is a blockchain? You have to define what that is first. And unfortunately, there's lots of different blockchains. Maybe not unfortunately, but because there are lots of different blockchains and their purpose, like Stellar isn't a blockchain service in that we provide blockchain services for other blockchains. Um, we're a payment, we're the global payment standard, right? So anybody that's doing payments, that's what we want. We want to be behind the payments that they're doing. So swap out blockchain for payments, and yes, but if it's blockchains, no.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that would be cool, right? Do I see that happening? I don't know. I think you make a good point about the space sort of being in full isolation mode. There is a lot of truth to that, right? Most people, when they pick a blockchain for some weird reason, they act like they're joining a basketball team or something, and they can only go for that team. And yeah, that's not something really we want to promote, right? Like, I don't know. I think eventually something like that will happen, right? Where we see more interoperability between different chains, and it's something we should absolutely focus on because of the example I gave earlier, where each chain has its own use case for the most part. Not very many are directly competing with each other, so making sure that all of these things are interoperable where they can be is extremely important, and not staying in isolation, mostly because most of this stuff is created in such a way that it's encouraging interoperability, ease of access, all that good stuff. And if you only self isolate and say, oh, it's only interoperable if it's built on our chain and nobody else's chain, then you're not really kind of following your mission. You're kind of going against yourself. And I think that's a little bit silly. So it would be great to see more chains exploring interoperability between each other. I know it's hard now because most people in this space are still trying to bootstrap their own network, and that's pretty hard, right? Like building a community, building liquidity, getting services to start building on your stuff. And maybe that's the reason everybody's kind of in that isolation mode. But hopefully over time, that starts to wear down. People start to explore more. As everybody kind of has their communities, they begin to work together. Start to see a lot of cool like technical innovation in that regard. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thought experiment. So hopefully over the next like 5 years, we'll see a lot more of that stuff. Let's see. Any other question? Doesn't look like it. I think we covered everything. Frederick responded regarding your math. I don't know if you see that.
I'm not looking at the stream right now.
Okay, gotcha. So he just responded in regards to your math, and I think he was just double checking it, so confirming you're right because you're so smart. Yeah, so awesome. If there's no more questions, I guess we can kind of wrap it up. If you aren't subscribed to this channel, please do. If you don't follow the stellar.org Twitter account, go follow it. That way you can keep up with all these updates. Also, make sure you kind of follow all of our different channels. We're going to have a lot of different live events going on over the next couple of weeks. So make sure you're tuning in for those. The more people that show up, the better. If you have any feedback regarding this, we're totally open to it. And maybe next time we can just like make it more conversational, or we can do another presentation. We're open to whatever. This is an ongoing experiment, so let us know. Anything you have to add, Tyler, go for it.
I think that's good. I appreciate everyone who joined, and great questions. I feel like having a little bit of a prompt helped. People ask some really good questions. Getting people's minds turning. Make sure those of you who can tune into the practical path payments talk that I'll be giving tomorrow. Keep an eye on the event spaces. Share those episodes that you find valuable. Gotta keep spreading the word. So appreciate those who've left us reviews. This has been a lot of fun. This is our 13th episode. So from where we started, here we are. It's pretty cool. Yeah, pretty fantastic.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks again, guys. We're going to cut this thing off. See you tomorrow. For those of you who show up to that stream, I won't be actually in the video, but I'll be in the chat.
I anticipate you to just be
We're just going to pop in the Zoom. Just torture your presentation. All right. Thanks, everybody who came. Subscribe if you haven't. Yeah. Peace.
All right. See you guys.